Hello, everyone. My name is Jeff Cope. On behalf of the whole team at RTI Innovation Advisors, I'd like to welcome you to our webinar on facilitating virtual collaboration sessions. We've all been thrown into a rather disruptive time in our lives thanks to this global pandemic. My hope today is that you and your loved ones are doing well, staying healthy, and will remain so for the duration. Today, we're going to share our recommendations on how to make virtual collaboration events effective and engaging. We're sharing our insights as a way to help us all adjust to the new working environment we find ourselves in. Let me set some context for today's session. The global pandemic is causing organizations around the world to be impacted in unprecedented ways. At a strategic level, executives are grappling with business continuity and resiliency issues and questioning current strategic plans and how those plans were formed. Priorities and resource allocations are shifting as organizations attempt to support remote workers, yet maintain business objectives. At a tactical level, this changing landscape of priorities has to be addressed and executed by a workforce that's simultaneously learning how to work remotely. We believe innovation in how we work, in the ways we deliver value, is more important than ever. Innovative activities cannot afford to stop because of changing work arrangements. The good news is they don't have to. Using the guidelines we'll cover today, you and your teams can continue to engage, collaborate, and innovate. It'll be different, but it can be powerful. Before we dive in, let me give a brief introduction to our team. RTI Innovation Advisors is a mission-driven innovation consultancy. We strive to help our clients maximize the impact of their innovative efforts. We operate at strategic and tactical levels. At the strategic level, we help organizations apply innovative strategic planning processes based on future methods. We also help stand up and optimize the innovation function within an organization. At the tactical level, we help inform innovation and new product development teams with insights on emerging technologies, growth vectors, and partners that can enable disruptive and breakthrough innovations. It's clear that we're in for a tough stretch over the next few months. Progress is being made, but the end is not yet quite clear. Please know that we're eager to help you and your teams get through the days ahead. Let us know how we can be helpful to you. Now I'm going to turn things over to our moderator, Carrie Strickland.
Thanks, Jeff, and welcome everyone. I'm Carrie Strickland from the Innovation Advisors team. I will be your host for today's webinar. We'll spend roughly the first half of our time together today in webinar presentation mode as I share some of our practices for virtual collaboration. After that, I'll facilitate a discussion with three of my colleagues who are all excellent facilitators, and we'll take some questions from you all on the line. The COVID-19 crisis, as Jeff mentioned, has brought some new challenges for all of us. Perhaps you joined today because you're wondering how to keep your innovation team moving forward while working remotely. Or perhaps you had an in-person session scheduled and now that's got to be done remotely. Maybe you're looking for ways to make sure your upcoming virtual session is engaging and effective. Today's session is all about virtual facilitation, what happens during the collaboration session. But good event design and planning before the session is equally important. If you weren't able to join our first webinar in this series on event design and planning, I encourage you to check out the recording. It's available on demand via the link, and we'll make sure that's included in the information you receive after the webinar today. So in our last webinar, to catch you up, my colleague Jim, who you'll hear from during the panel later today, outlined our recipe for successful virtual collaborations. He spoke about the principles of good event design, highlighted what you should consider when planning a virtual engagement, and demonstrated some tools that you can incorporate into your virtual collaboration events. Today's webinar focuses on virtual facilitation or execution. Our objective is to open your eyes to the different skills and considerations that go into virtual event facilitation, regardless of the specific tools you're using or specific activities that your team will be undertaking. We hope you leave this session with a broader view of what it means to be the facilitator of a virtual session, and that you feel better prepared to enter into your next facilitation experience. Personally, I also hope this time helps us all remember to extend some empathy and some grace to our facilitators when we're serving as participants and we're all kind of figuring out this new way of working together. I think we could all use some of that as we adjust to these new ways of working. So at this time, I'd like to ask a quick poll question to get a sense for our audience today for some of the things that you're working on. So we'd like to know, are you going to be facilitating internal sessions with your own colleagues, external sessions with clients or with others, or both? We'll give you just a few seconds to dash in your responses there. Lots of responses coming in. That's good. In the chat box too, that's helpful. Coworkers and students, right? Good. All right, looks like our responses have slowed. Shane, I think we can broadcast. Great, so thank you all for your input. This will definitely help us frame some of the information we share today, especially how the panelists respond in the later half of our time today. So it looks like a lot of you are balancing both kinds of sessions, right? Like we have to find good ways to work with our colleagues in this environment, and we have to find good ways to work with others, whether it's students or partner organizations or clients. All right. So as we jump in, I wanted to say a word about why skilled facilitation is so important for virtual collaboration events. Now, we know that team culture plays a really important role in successful collaboration, right? Edgar Schein, formerly of MIT, talks about organizational culture as the ways of working together towards common goals that have been followed so frequently and successfully that people don't even think about trying to do things another way. So more succinctly, team culture is the patterns and behaviors we use to resolve conflict and make decisions collaboratively. When we're children, our culture of play is formed on the playground, right? Through both positive and negative interactions that we have with others as we make friends, or maybe we don't. And we learn through explicit direction from parents and from teachers. As we go through this process, we learn the norms and behaviors that form the culture of play. And the challenge for us in this current moment is that when it comes to virtual collaboration, many of us are back to entering that playground for the first time. And as we have more and more virtual collaboration interactions, our team cultures will start to form. But through that process, the facilitator has an important role to play in shaping that culture. Of course, the facilitator influences the team culture, but ultimately how the team interacts is up to the participants, is up to the people. This is especially true for those of you who are leaders within your teams. Your teammates will notice and model your behavior. So staying attentive, signaling engagement, whether that's visually or by using the chat function, all of that matters. Also, trust your facilitator. Be willing to try some new things and be patient with yourself. Be patient with your teammates as your teams form their new virtual collaboration culture. So my colleague Jim, who I mentioned earlier, authored this resource on facilitating the front end of innovation that we've published. And in it, he outlined 6 aspects of what we call the facilitator's mindset. It's a reminder that as facilitators, we're there to enable the participants, keep them oriented towards the session objectives. We should also set the example for the attitude and energy we want to receive from the participants and help them face and work through tough disagreements openly and productively. So there are three main parts to the journey of the facilitator: plan the event, facilitate the session, and follow up. The best facilitators, though, give just as much thought to the journey of their participants. What do they experience from the time they receive the meeting invite and pre-work through to the time they move off to complete their action items? The core work of facilitation happens in those middle three steps of the journey: greeting participants as they enter the virtual space, engaging them in collaboration, and then helping them exit with purpose and intent to go have impact. The facilitator has a role to play in each step of the virtual collaboration experience, regardless of the goals of that particular engagement. But first, we'll talk about the facilitator activities during the enter step. As folks log in, the facilitator acts as the gatekeeper. If you're the facilitator, you should worry about security so your participants can relax and trust each other. It's your job to know who's supposed to be on the line, who's not, whose random phone number that is that's showing up, right? You should greet participants by name as they join and welcome them. This is especially important if your participants don't know each other well. You should use a randomized meeting ID, passwords, a waiting room feature, whatever security measures are available in the particular platform you're using that can help prevent unauthorized entry. A lot of you have probably read about Zoom bombing at this point, where people randomly enter Zoom rooms and share offensive content. Maybe some of you have even experienced that, hopefully not. But that can really derail the team culture and trust right off the bat, right? That would be very, very disruptive. So take all the precautions you can, but without setting up hurdles or barriers that make it difficult for the participants to gain entry, right? You want to make sure it's easy and straightforward for the people who are supposed to be there to get into the room. If you hear someone join midway through the call, as we all have heard at one point or another, make sure you pause the discussion so that you and everyone else knows who's joined. I think participants sometimes can feel a little awkward, maybe worry that they're going to be perceived as like questioning their colleagues if they stop what they're saying and say, "Who is that?" So it's your job as the facilitator to step in there and say, "We're going to pause. Hello," to whoever that was. Let us know who's joined. So another word about trust in these engagements. In Stephen Covey's text from, I guess, quite a few years ago now, probably, The Speed of Trust, he said, in a high trust relationship, you can say the wrong thing and people will still get your meaning. It's okay. But in a low trust relationship, you can be very measured, even precise, and they'll still misinterpret you. So what does that mean for us as facilitators? Participation in virtual collaboration requires people to try new things, such as new ways of capturing information, when we're at least on video, like we are now, or maybe even being recorded. And that puts us distinctly out of our comfort zone. If the people in a virtual team don't trust each other, it will be harder for them to work together successfully. So as a facilitator, you should consider how much trust exists between your participants and how much do you need them to trust each other in order to be effective. If you have many participants who don't know each other, working together for a short, just 1 or 2 hour session, and it's only one time, you can probably build the basic amount of trust you need via some quick warm-up exercises that just help people get comfortable with each other. On the other hand, if you're facilitating a team that knows each other really well and has worked together for a long time, they may already have a high level of trust that can enable you to move quickly Or they may have a low level of trust that requires you to build in extra steps, more transparency, or be more forceful and direct as a facilitator to keep things in bounds and moving. When we facilitate a virtual session, one of the first things we do is set guardrails. It's one way we help define the norms for that interaction. And the guardrails that we use depend on the group, right? Whether they're familiar with each other or not, whether they trust each other or not. I thought about the guardrails I've used and seen others used, and they fall into three general categories. So I invite you to add your favorite guardrails into the chat box as we go here. So first, some guardrails are expectations, such as stay engaged and participate in each activity. That's something that I expect you to do as a participant. Others are requests, like close email and chat programs so you can focus. I'm asking you to do that. I would really like it if you did, but it's not quite as strong as the expectation. And lastly, some are permissions, such as take a break whenever you need to. Again, these guardrails are highly tailored each time to the session objectives and the mix of participants that you have in that moment. Checking the chat here. No guardrails coming in, but that's okay. If you think of others later, here's a good one. Allow side conversations to happen in the chat window so you don't get too distracted with the side conversations. That's great. And a good three-part one. Step up, speak up, and follow up. I like that. That's concise and tight. That's good. So after the guardrails, what next? Just like our weightlifter here who's chalking up his hands to get ready, you should facilitate a warm-up activity for your team. Warm-up activities have three main goals. They're an opportunity to introduce individuals or groups to each other, to get people familiar with the platform or tools they'll be using, and they set the tone for the teamwork that's to come. But how do you choose a good warm-up activity? Think about how many people you have and how complex the interactions are that you need them to complete. Will they only be asked to do some simple voting like we've done in the poll question today? That's pretty easy. That's a pretty simple interaction. Or do you need them to do something more complex, like placing and arranging virtual cards in a platform like Mural, or drawing out their ideas on a virtual whiteboard? If you only have a few people and you just need them to go through some simple interactions, choose something fun, such as just asking people, what did you eat for breakfast or lunch, and have some dialogue around that to get everyone's voice in the room and get people comfortable. If you have more people, choose a warm-up that's quick, such as asking people to place their names on a map, marking their location, and share what they like about that place. If you work in a really geographically distributed team, that could be really cool. Like, here from the person who's in Europe today and the person who's in Latin America today. As interactions get more complex, consider a warm-up that lets participants practice whatever it is they'll be asked to then do, but practice on a topic that's low risk, like pet animal names. Right? If you're going to ask participants to draw, choose something like the classic draw how to make toast warm-up exercise that can be done either virtually or live at an individual's desk, right? And by doing the warm-up exercise or the practice run, you make sure if it's at their desk, everybody's got their paper or notes or pens. And if it's virtual, everyone knows how to use the platform. The more people you have, warm-ups for complex interactions definitely become more difficult. So I advise there, consider doing the warm-up in breakout groups where it's a little more manageable. Now let's talk about what happens in the engage part of the experience once participants are in the workshop and ready to collaborate. Within the virtual collaboration team, the main roles are the convener, the key stakeholder who sets the meeting objectives, and the participants. So then the facilitator who delivers the session, the scribe who organizes and captures information, and the tech support people who arrange and manage meeting logistics may or may not be part of the core team. Whenever it's practical to do so, we encourage separating roles of convener and participant from the roles of facilitator, scribe, and tech support. The more complex the meeting or high risk of the topic, the more important this becomes. When a team I was leading recently back in the fall needed to have a virtual collaboration session to align on a new communications role that we were adding to the team, I asked one of my other colleagues who was not a part of that team to come in and facilitate for us, so I could focus on listening to what my team members had to say about what they wanted and needed in this communication support role. And since none of the participants had to think about the facilitation tasks, they could focus all their mental energy, all their bandwidth on envisioning this new communications role. When we host more complex meetings with a large number of participants, like today's webinar, we rely on RTI's tech support team like Shane, who's the host for us today, to help cover the logistics and troubleshooting. And it really is a great help and helps make sure things go smoothly. So let's talk about the participants. They're there to join in the core activities of that workshop. Your role as facilitator is to help make sure they're engaged and effective while they do it. In general, I think you can expect somewhere between 10 and 30 minutes of attention from your participants on a given activity before you need to give them something fresh to do. Also, if your session includes presentations, like maybe background context or an update on work that's been completed since the group's last meeting, remember that as a facilitator, you're not there for the presentations or to hear the content, no matter how interesting they might be. Your focus should remain on the participants. You should be watching them for signals of engagement so you can prompt the presenters to adapt. So we've all facilitated in probably more than one virtual call where it sounds like somebody on the phone is in the middle of a marching band. Right? As facilitator, you should have the participant list up and open so you can see whose line is generating that background noise, and use your powers to mute them if it becomes distracting. You can always unmute them when they need to chime in, so it shouldn't feel like a big deal. Also, I think we all have a tendency to speak longer when we're by ourselves at our computer. And this can really extend the presentation part of a workshop to take up just too much time. I was facilitating a short virtual session last week, and my presenters ran over, reducing our brainstorming time. If I were in the room, I would have found a way to catch their eye, or I would have stood up or maybe approached the podium, but I couldn't do any of that virtually. So to make sure this doesn't happen to you, I would suggest you have some pre-established line of communication between the presenters and facilitator so you can signal them to speed up or slow down if you need to. To prevent the participants from having to interrupt the presenters to ask questions, encourage them to use a raise hand function or submit questions via the chat so that you can recognize them at the next logical discussion point. When facilitating virtual sessions, I think it's harder to correct and redirect the participants if they're not completing an activity the way that you planned it. If you're in the room, you can go up to that person and help them directly, because it's harder to do in the virtual environment. So this means it's especially important to give your brain a loudspeaker, communicate about everything you're thinking. Remember that some people will better understand by reading instructions and others will better understand by listening to you give them instructions. So in addition to verbal instructions, we suggest write down the basic steps, have them pre-written on whatever template you're using to capture information while you collaborate. Don't assume the participants understand what you're asking them to do. Also, be really explicit in the instructions you give, and whenever you can, demonstrate what you'd like them to do. So if you want them to capture ideas, say, in individual rows in a spreadsheet in one column, demonstrate that. Fill in the first few rows with some example ideas while you're giving the instruction. That will help them hear what you want them to do and see what you want them to do, and then they can read what you want them to do, right? And if you do all three of those with hope, they will, you'll be in the right spot. So constraints. These help us be concise and keep time moving. Time boundaries are just as important virtually as they are in person, but as facilitators, we need to build in some extra flexibility. For example, if you would set 5 minutes of individual working time to capture challenges around the topic during an in-person session, plan a few extra minutes, say 7 or even 10 virtually instead of 5 minutes, in case there are struggles with the technology platform. Use a timer that's visible to the participants if possible, and warn them about 30 seconds to a minute before you end an activity. You can also use your information capture template to signal boundaries. Pre-populating a certain number of boxes or rows or cards for participants to capture information in will help them understand whether to shoot for 2 ideas or 10. This will also help you gauge how close you are to completion and help ensure you have the right amount of information to carry into the next activity of the workshop. So that takes us through the enter and engage steps. Now let's talk about exit, what happens at the end of the workshop, and then extend, what happens after the workshop, because the facilitator has roles to play here too. So if you've ever tried to learn to play golf, one of the things you will learn early on is that the follow through, the actions that you take after the club makes contact with the ball, is a critical part of having a good swing. And the same is true when you're facilitating virtual collaboration engagements. Your job as facilitator doesn't stop once you get through the workshop activities, once those are completed. You need to make sure you finish strong in order to enable the team to have impact. And what does that look like? Even the best and most engaging collaboration sessions won't generate impact unless the follow-up actions are really clear. So we suggest thinking about follow-on actions across 3 time horizons. What will the team members do in the next 2 days, 2 weeks, and 2 months? If you can, suggest individuals to take on action items that you think they may be particularly interested in based on what you heard them say during the discussion. People who are engaged with a particular idea are much more likely to complete their action items on time, right? So if you can pick someone to assign that action to who's fired up about it, that much the better. You can also offer to send individual reminders in a few days or a week to people who would appreciate that. Lastly, make sure you share out the action items quickly after the session while the discussion is still fresh. After the virtual collaboration engagement itself is completed, the facilitator has one more job to do: summarize and share the output of the session. Don't forget that the participants trusted you to enter their space and be a part of their discussion. So make sure to thank them, express gratitude for that. Summarize the session outputs with notes about who attended, what was discussed, and what happened during the meeting. And be sure, if you generate content in a cloud-based platform in some form, make sure that it can be shared and accessed by all. Okay, so we have reached the panel discussion portion of our time together. I see that we have a couple questions that have been loaded into the chat. I just want to acknowledge those. Thank you, Jerry and Stephen, for those. We will make sure to incorporate those as a part of our panel discussion here. So if you have other questions for our panelists, feel free to pop those in as we go. So I'm going to stop sharing. So at this time, I'd like to say a welcome to our three panelists, Laura Martin, Amanda Rose, and Jim Redden. So I have one or two questions prepared for each of them. So in order to demonstrate good facilitator behaviors, I'll pose a question to each of you in turn. Other panelists, if you'd like to chime in and add perspective to a question that I've asked somebody else, I would love for you to do that. Just use the raise hand function in the chat and I'll recognize you. And as I mentioned, we'll work in questions from you all, the webinar attendees, as we go. So I'd like to start with some brief introductions. Laura, if you would introduce yourself first.
Hi, I'm Laura Martin. Nice to meet all of you. I'm a Senior Director of Organizational Development at RTI. And I've got kind of a long history in virtual facilitation. Sort of the quickest version is since 2006, I've done culture consulting, really focusing on when organizations shift and change. And so you can imagine as the shift and change is happening, there's loads and loads of conversations, lots of things to think through and plan. I've also been a leadership coach and consultant, mostly focusing on sort of a vice president and senior leader level on what do we do now that we're in the middle of the change, especially when it's hard. And most recently, for the last couple of years, I've been leading our talent development function here at RTI, supporting our professional leaders at RTI. So working on the leadership development program, our scientific stature development program. And this means that I'm literally facilitating virtually 3 to 12 sessions a week that are on average 2 hours. So the questions online around how do you take big sections and make them into something more concise is exactly the work that I do every day right now. Thanks for the introduction space, Carrie.
Wonderful. Thank you, Laura. Amanda, would you go next?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. Wonderful to be with you today. My name is Amanda Rose. I have the pleasure of working with Carrie and Jim and all the other innovation advisors within RTI. In terms of facilitation experience, I've largely been involved in facilitating cross-sector systems change initiatives where we bring together folks from business and government and other parts of the economy to think about kind of large-scale visions for what change, especially within the agricultural space, might look like. And so that is really a dynamic space to bring people together and think through ideas of future change and how we might get there.
Excellent. Thank you, Amanda. And Jim, would you provide your introduction?
Sure, thank you. Hey everybody, my name is Jim Redden. I've been with the Innovation Advisors team for the last 5 years. And my virtual facilitation experience really centers around helping innovation teams in the context of everything from identifying mega trends impacting and shaping strategy on the front end, all the way through to facilitating groups doing design sprints or rapid prototyping activities or even consumer validation and what that looks like. And we've done many of these things virtually in the past as well as in person. And so I'm excited to get to share some of that experience with the folks on the line today. Thanks, Carrie.
Great. Thank you, Jim. So our first question, Amanda, I'd like you to chime in first on this one. What are some of the things that you do as a facilitator that helps create a virtual space that encourages really authentic and productive dialogue between the participants?
Wonderful. Thanks, Carrie. So I think it's important to just kind of question first, why does authenticity matter in a virtual space? And I think you really brought it home when you talk about because it drives connection. And people show up differently in a space where they can be themselves, they can offer their ideas without fear of judgment and critique. And to be honest, that can feel really vulnerable, especially in a virtual space where it can be harder to pick up on social cues, Maybe it's harder to get that encouragement of a smile from a colleague or see nodding heads amongst the crowd. But if we can let ourselves show up in an authentic way and maybe be a little bit vulnerable in that space, that's where the magic happens, especially in the innovation space. That's where those really brilliant nuggets of the what ifs and the how might we's emerge when we can lean into that. So I think that's why it's really important to try to uphold an authentic collaboration space when we're in this kind of virtual dynamic. So to your question about the role of the facilitator in that, I think it really starts with the tone, the cadence, the type of interaction that the facilitator kind of presents and brings to the group. And so that means bringing your own authentic self, your own authentic voice to that. Knowing your own facilitation style, how you like to interact with a group is so key. I know many of us as professionals, we've been in really different types of settings. There are certain facilitators that are all about energy, like being dynamic in front of a crowd, and they're really that kind of inspirational voice. There are other facilitators that are a bit more maybe methodical, maybe a little bit quieter in their style and how they kind of interact with the group. And all of those facilitation styles can be really, really productive. It can really help drive a team forward. But it has to be rooted in who you really are. And if you show up in a collaboration space and you're acting completely differently than you would have in normal interactions, that's probably a warning sign. And I think another piece of the personal responsibility for the facilitator is around preparation. So how can you come into the virtual collaboration space as prepared to lead the process as possible, such that you don't become a distraction and you don't take away from the content of the discussions that are happening. And I often think about facilitators as tour guides, and you're asking the group, hey, trust me, I know where we're going, come with me on this journey. And what if your tour guide is playing with the map or circling the block a few times or being kind of unconfident, not confident in the way that they're interacting? And I think that's where the personal preparation comes in. If you can come into the space knowing your agenda, your transitions, how you're going to be utilizing technology along the way, then that trust builds in your participants and they're more willing to go on the journey with you. So those are just a few thoughts. I'd love to hear from others, other panelists, or other questions from you, Carrie.
Great. Laura, I'd like to hear from you next. You talked a little bit about organizational change, I think in your introduction. So can you help us all understand what are some of the cultural changes that we should experience as our team starts to try to collaborate virtually?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So there's, if we think about the dynamic of going from being in person and having relationships and the clarity of who gets to speak when, and being able to see people's face and know that, oh, right, so-and-so wants to speak now because 50% of our communications communicate through our body language, right? We can see that person's itching to say something. That's much harder to manage virtually. And so setting up consistent norms, and I love that you had norms as one of your checklist items, doing that not just episodically, not just for this important meeting, but for all meetings, getting really clear for yourself as the facilitator or as the leader, what is the culture that I want to set in my virtual meetings? And whether it's for brainstorming, for problem solving, or for communicating information, making sure it's always the same set of expectations. And so some of my examples are things like, we're always going to have our video on. I know in my team who are the quiet ones, so I'm going to let them know up front what questions I want them to answer with me in the meeting before we get to the meeting, so they have the confidence to say it out loud. I'm also constantly asking myself as either a facilitator or leader, what's my ask? What's my ask, and how do I make sure I prep my team for the ask as a cultural norm? So folks who might need time to ruminate, especially the folks who need more processing time, have that time to process, and we're not just getting the folks who are quick to be extroverted in those meetings. So I'm really thinking about what's the cultural space and tone I want to set, and then breeding commitment to that culture set. I also think about the way we use visuals very differently. In a meeting, you can whiteboard. In a face-to-face meeting, you might have a big PowerPoint deck, and that might be the background. And it's okay if that PowerPoint deck has all the words on it. But when we're in a virtual meeting, that visual becomes the primary thing that folks are seeing. And so how you set your culture and tone through that visual is huge. That deck can't look the same anymore. That PowerPoint's got to be trimmed down. It's got to have fewer words. You've got to create space for others to add their voice to it. So those are some of the things that I consider when I'm thinking about how do I set my culture and how do I set it consistently to breed the commitment that I want from my folks on the call. Regardless if I'm delivering information, brainstorming and coming up with some great new ideas to be innovative, or problem solving a real challenge. It's got to sit across all three.
Great, thank you. And Jim, I'd love for you to jump in here too.
Yeah, I just wanted to build on what Laura was saying. It is critical for facilitators to know the participants that they're facilitating for. And because of our survey question, we know that some folks are not only engaging with internal teams who they may already know, but they're also trying to facilitate some external groups. As facilitators, part of your job in pre-work is to talk with the key stakeholders, the convener, in referencing back to Carrie's kind of roles matrix, to understand who in the group are the quiet ones, who are the ones who are going to likely or potentially dominate the conversation, who will need facilitated kind of in different ways in this virtual space. That's critical background. I also really liked what Laura said about kind of directing participants' attention as a facilitator. When you're in a room in a physical space, you know, you walk to one side of the room where you've got something hanging on the wall, and that directs people's attention to a particular space in the room. In the virtual space, it's critical to think about, like, what am I showing on my screen at this time? Do I want people paying attention to me and my words? Maybe I pause my screen share for a moment so that I become the center focus of attention. Or maybe I need to be more methodical and intentional about bite-sized pieces of information at a time to really help control folks' attention and engagement with where I want it to be as a useful tool.
Great, it's very helpful. And Laura, could you speak a little bit about some of the outcomes of a well-formed virtual team culture? Help us understand what it looks like when it's working well.
Yeah, when it's going really smoothly, there are a couple of things are happening. One, you're not the only voice. So there's this huge misconception that as facilitator, somehow it's my voice the whole time. And the reality is a really strong facilitator will know exactly when and how to pull in the voices of other people. So one, the rest of the room isn't fatigued by your voice because it's exhausting to hear one person talk the whole time. And two, to make sure that everyone understands that their expertise is across the room, whether that's with a client and making sure you're engaging them in between questions and making sure you're getting clarity on their problem statement or clarity on their need, or it's with your internal team to understand the different perspectives. So being really clear about when you're gonna bring in the other voices, and when it's going really well, that happens more organically. Another thing that it becomes more obvious that it's going well, that you've bred a culture, is that people are using the videos, they're following the norms, and they're holding each other accountable. I was recently on a 30-person meeting, and it was a part 3 of a 6-part series. And someone goes, "Hey, you're not so-and-so, your video's not on." When you see that happen, that should be a real key for you that you've bred the culture that you want to have, right? Others are holding each other accountable. And another piece is that you're noticing that your visuals are connecting to people. The comment, Jim, that you just made about turning your video or your PowerPoint down so that your voice is up, your face is up, and then switching back. Getting people to use the annotate tools or getting them to engage in the visual, and they're doing that like without being asked, especially if it's a multi-part series of conversations, is another great way to know that your culture, the culture that you're wanting to create that's collaborative, assuming that that's the culture you're trying to create, is embedding. So in some ways, what's really smart is to sit down and write down what would it look like for you if everyone was living the culture set that you put forward. And then as you notice it, reinforce it by saying out loud, I love the way we're doing X, Y, Z, right? There's this progress principle. When we notice that people are living the culture we want and we say it out loud, I really appreciate the way so-and-so just spoke up, it encourages that behavior. So those are some easy ways to be able to tell that you're getting the outcome to your culture.
Excellent. Thank you, Laura. Very, I think, astute watchers of the webinar portion of the day will have noticed that when we talked about the journey of the participant, it had 5 steps in it, and we only spoke about 4 of them. We didn't talk about entice, what happens before the meeting, and how do you get people prepared and excited to come into that space and be productive. So Jim, I wonder if you could share a few words about what you do in advance of a session to get people ready.
Sure, yeah. So this kind of really builds on some of the things we've already talked about on the panel in terms of setting culture, setting norms and expectations. Your first interaction with participants really begins that journey of setting those norms and expectations. And so before I decide what that enticement step or that pre-work really is going to look like, really start with kind of what are the objectives and what's the context of the group that I'm with. Is this a 40-person group getting together for the first time and we have an hour and a half, or is this a group of 5 and we've been meeting every week for 3 months and this is kind of an ongoing thing? So with that, my answers are a little context dependent in that regard, but I'll give you a couple examples of some things that I usually do. The big question around virtual engagements often has to do with pre-work, right? How much pre-work can I reasonably expect my participants to do ahead of time? And as a facilitator, you have to be honest and realistic about those expectations and really understand if it is essential that participants come in, let's say, having reviewed the business unit strategy before we move to an ideation session that builds on those elements of strategy. As a facilitator, you might want to think about putting in some mechanisms to ensure that the people have done their pre-work. There's a couple of things that I do. Sometimes I might even just have like a single question that I ask people to respond to that ties back to the pre-work in some way, whether that's an article or perhaps a document. Another key element of pre-work I think about is how do I essentially get people familiar with the tools that we're going to use in an innovation session ahead of the session. So if we're using an online whiteboarding platform, part of my pre-work assignment might be ensuring that people can actually log on and interact with the whiteboard by giving them a small task. Go in, put your name, and answer these 2 or 3 questions on the whiteboard space ahead of time. That provides me an easy way to see who's done the pre-work, and I can follow up and reach out to make sure that, the most important part of pre-work is, number 1, are we setting the norms ahead of time? And then number 2, are we going to hit the ground running from the beginning at the start of the session?
Great, thanks, Jim. And one of our questions here in the chat from Stephen is about multi-part sessions. How important is it to continue the facilitation offline, kind of until the total set of all sessions is complete and kind of normal project activity can happen again? So I think a lot of the things you talked about, a lot of the same tools and tactics could be used in between virtual sessions if there's maybe not pre-work, but homework, right, assigned between sessions. Is there anything else you might suggest between sessions?
Yeah, Carrie, I really like Steve's question because I think it brings up a broader point that I think it's important to make about virtual engagements. Many times people think if this took, if we were going to do this in a room and we were going to get everybody together for 4 hours, maybe I can do it virtually and accomplish the same thing in 2 hours. Like that's generally the wrong direction in terms of the total time allocation. It's probably actually going to take longer to accomplish the same set of objectives if you're in a virtual space than if you were all together in the room working on it. So the individual sessions may be shorter. You can accomplish that in maybe a series of 3 2-hour sessions instead of 1 4-hour session, but make sure you're acknowledging the fact that the total length of time to accomplish things in the virtual space usually grows as opposed to shrinks.
Mm-hmm. Laura, would you like to add in there too?
Sure. So I was going to also offer, not only does it take longer and you need more sessions, you also need to create a collaborative space. So it's not just the meeting where things are being talked about and discussed, but create, whether you use Teams or Slack or whatever is your collaboration space. And for every single session, especially if I know it's going to be a sequence of sessions, I always have, I don't call it homework because people don't do homework. I call it between work. I try to come up with creative new words. So the between work typically is research something and respond to something and put it here in this spreadsheet, and or this, whatever is the tool that you use. For us, it's often a spreadsheet or some kind of working document that is shared like a Google Doc or a SharePoint doc. But that becomes a space that I introduce every session and I bring up in every session. And just like I said about the progress principle, I thank the folks who actually did the work, not as a way to shame the ones who didn't, but to try to encourage the ones who didn't to come along. So I think it's incredibly important to create that collaboration space in between. And I would be really, really clear on what is the task at hand between. So it might be normal project work, but I find that you have to be more deliberate in the tell, more directive in the tell of what you need, who's going to do what when. So some of those project management skills that you've sort of gathered over your career become really critical when you're all virtual, because it's easy to walk away and say, oh, someone else is doing that. The visual cues of who's doing things is lost virtually.
Great. So I want to get to some of the other participant questions. I see Jerry chiming in that they've had the same experience of the time frame growing as the session expands, and I think that's quite right. The other question there was about common tools for moving the session along, right? When you're in the midst of the collaboration activities, and you know that you've planned a certain amount of time for each part, but you see maybe there are a lot of comments, a lot of questions that are being chatted, or maybe people speaking up directly. Are there some tools or techniques you use to kind of prod things along? Jim, with the raise your hand function. Excellent.
Sure. In the room, oftentimes facilitators use the parking lot, right? Which is a physical space where if we need to table a conversation, we say, your participant, your question is worthy of discussion. It's not part of what we need to do right now to move us along, but we're going to put this over here in a parking lot so that they can see it's not lost and their concerns aren't kind of not being ignored. As a virtual facilitator, I find it very helpful to create a virtual parking lot space where we can move conversations that still need to happen, but need to be moved to a later time or date, just like you would in a physical room.
Carrie, one of the functions someone on the Robert asked, is Mural your most favorite collaboration tool? I enjoy using Mural mainly because I think it also helps in terms of driving the conversation forward, where you can actually set up your Mural to move the team through different activities, and by actually moving them to a different place on the mural, the whiteboard, that is actually a cue that we're moving on. So I think that's quite important. Just allow that navigation of the virtual space along the kind of the journey you're wanting to take people on.
Great. And I see Carrie asked a question about struggling to get students to be really interactive during even brief virtual meetings. Most won't turn on their microphone or chat to answer questions. Very similar to being in class in some ways, where people just don't speak up. A word of encouragement, Carrie, this is not only students, adults also do this. Laura, I wonder if you have thoughts on how to kind of prod people into engagement.
Yeah, for sure. So if I put on my facilitating education hat for adults, this is an endemic problem in our classrooms until there's that comfort of, I know the room and I know that I can say things and I'm not going to feel embarrassed. That said, for all the sessions where it's a brand new session, I don't know anyone, or we haven't taught that group before, it's not part of a learning sequence, but it's the very first time, or I'm changing my expectations, I will send an email the day before, sort of saying, for tomorrow's session, I expect, Now, because I'm the teacher, I sort of have a certain level of authority, intend to have people listen. And then when I get to the session itself, I'll try to open up with something soft and fun. There's a current research study out now that says if we start off a session with something fun and maybe a little bit revealing, we're going to get 26% more creativity from the session, which means we get 26% more voice in the session. So just opening up and creating some comfort in the room right away is helpful. And I am a shameless caller. So if I know, I see someone's name, I'll say, hey, Jim, I'd love to hear your response to this question. It's going to be really hard for Jim to stay silent. I mean, how awkward is that, right? So as the facilitator for the learning, it is part of my job is to help draw people out. If I've set the expectation, if I've created a safe and fun environment, and then I call on them, it tends to work more quickly. I hope that helps.
Great. Jim, do you have other thoughts there?
Yes. So in addition to being a facilitator, I also used to be a high school physics teacher. And so I empathize very much with this challenge of remote instruction for students. There's a couple things that I would leave folks with as we run out of time. Number one, whether it's adults or children, as facilitators, physical movement is a critical part of engaging in a session. When we're in a room, we'll have people move tables, get up and go to the wall. In the virtual space, we got to realize we're all sitting at the computer for X amount of time in a row. So as a facilitator, I don't have the perfect answer, but other than to say, design movement of some kind into blocks of time with your groups. The second tip would be think explicitly about the modes, not necessarily the activities, but first think about the modes. There's kind of maybe presentation as one mode. There's discussion between individuals in small groups as one mode. And then there's also individual reflection time and quiet time. And in the physical space, I feel like facilitators naturally balance those three. In the virtual space, it's also good to remember time for reflection and individual work is just as valuable in moving teams forward as that open dialogue.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for spending time with us today. I know there were a few questions that we did not get to. We will follow up with you all by email to share thoughts and make sure that we get you the answers that you seek. We are always here, happy to chat with you, happy to help if you need other ideas about how to make your sessions more effective. Feel free to reach out to me or reach out to Jeff Cope, and I'll certainly help connect you to any of our other panelists you'd like to speak with. With that, thank you all, and I hope you have a great Friday.